Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Adventures in DevOps. I'm your host, Will Button, and back after attending, it was the DevOps conference in Zurich last week, right, Warren?
Yeah, for sure. And I actually listened to a little bit of last episode, and I felt like you introduced me even though I wasn't there. So I feel like I have a free, I don't need to introduce myself this episode.
Right.
I will say that I owe everyone an interesting fact. And this time when we were at the conference, we specifically went out and hosted an open space where I talked with a group of experienced DevOps practitioners, and we were really trying to define what a platform even is. I think this word is thrown around everywhere. And after an hour, we really came to a great conclusion. It's something horizontal. And that's... I think there's an aspect here where it doesn't offer value to the end user, I think is an important thing. So one definition we had was everything other than the product, which is interesting to think that the platforms we build aren't value add, but there's some interesting deep dive there. But yeah, no, it was great. It was a great conference. I'm back. I'm happy to be back though.
Right on. Cool. Happy to have you back. And then also joining us in the studio, the co-founder and CEO of Kurtosis, Galen Marchetti. Galen, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and hello, everybody.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here. We've talked a little bit in the past, and then I've also been using Kurtosis a little bit in its very basic level. But give us like the high level overview of Kurtosis, and then we're going to dig into like what led us to this point in life.
So the highest level overview is that Kurtosis makes it easy to get development environments and testing environments set up for backend systems. Think something like Docker Compose or Helm charts with more parameterizability, more flexibility, and some things that give you greater portability guarantees.
Gotcha. So when we're talking about dev environments, like as a developer working on a product, I need to test the code that I'm writing, but that means I need to run the application, but then I also need all the supporting microservices, and then those are completely worthless without the data that gives me some kind of real world or pseudo real world scenario to test against. Is that right?
That's about right. And I think a good way to think about the pain that kind of motivated the whole thing is that part about running other people's code. Like running your own code, usually people have a handle on that one. It's when you need 6 or 7 other microservices plus the data. Now you have to dig into how do I set these things up? And a lot of the time you get stuck, at least I get stuck at that phase for an inordinate amount of time. And that's kind of the heart of what we're doing.
Yeah, for sure. I can think back of different scenarios where I've addressed this in the past, and some of the approaches I've used are the like the 7,000 line bash script. There's the golden machine or the golden VM that no one's allowed to touch because it has everything on it right at the moment. There's trying to bribe your security team to let you connect to the staging environment across the firewall. So those are some of the approaches I've used in the past.
Yeah, it's exactly right. It's exactly right. And it's what a lot of the times people get a good system set up for kind of a golden path they do all the time. But then there's this like long tail of things that you always do a long tail thing, maybe once a week, but it's a different long tail thing. And it's that set of issues, right? Security, and you have to touch the golden VM, fork it, break it, and it just adds up.
For sure. Warren, what's your approach in solving this problem?
Oh, wow. I think we only have like an hour on this. There's something here where if you have really high separation, low coupling between your individual microservices, you can just spin up the one that you've got on your machine. We use local stack for our infrastructure, but I think that's a very extreme perspective, and it takes a lot to really get there, and we focused on having that at the beginning. And if you come from a monolith world or one where the architecture wasn't really figured out, there's this sort of dead zone in the middle where your services are still unfortunately coupled in some way, and you really can't get the value out of them without having some of the ancillary pieces also spun up and working at the same time.
Right on, for sure. So Galen, obviously there was a set of circumstances in your life that led you to say, this is a real problem and I'm going to give it my best shot at starting, and that led to a company. What kind of scenarios were you working in that made you realize this is what you want to do?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple. The earliest instance of this innate pain, it came at my senior year of college. My senior year of college, I was doing a research project on distributed databases, and this was right before Ethereum launched, which is a cryptocurrency. And I was doing a research project to explore different consensus mechanisms, so like low-level protocol comms between nodes. I wanted to just spin up 3 nodes of this network just to experiment with my different consensus mechanism. Nearly impossible to do that at the time. And a lot of my project was oriented around simply getting the thing spun up in the first place. Of course, the code worked on the developers' laptops. It worked on the DevOps laptops, didn't work on my laptop. And it wasn't about building a particular node. It was about getting the cluster of the system set up correctly, where there's really no good abstraction that gets you that very consistently. You can get it in certain architectures in certain ways, decently consistently, but that was the first instance. It was very frustrating. Like, why won't this thing just spin up? It's the simplest application. Just run it as it is. Yeah, that was the very first one. I saw it later in my career as well. I was working at a company that had a internal tool that spun up a full microservice stack. You can think maybe 200 microservices. And it was used for a variety of purposes between dev, demoing, UAT, so like high level just testing like user workflows to see how they would work. That took a lot of effort to get that system spun up. And at the essence of it, it's the same issue. I just want to run the system in a configuration that makes sense for the workflow I'm doing. And it can be remarkably hard to do that. So these sets of issues, it's kind of the feeling of like, this shouldn't be this way. It should be decently easy to just run software. It should be hard to like build software that's amazing, but it should be decently easy to run it. It's kind of the feeling of the way the world should be that kind of motivated the entire start into kurtosis.
Right on. Yeah. And I think maybe just part of that is we build these complex systems, but for most of us, once we build our production environment, the people who really have the skills to build those, they don't build a second production. The part where this pain is really felt is in the development teams, where they're trying to, build and tear these down to test different features and add new features to it.
Yes, and that's one of the main themes that I've learned while going through this journey is it's a lot of the times these development environments, they're about getting as close to production as possible, but safe, and you can do the workflow you need to do. But the main value axis is how close can you get to production? So like Warren mentioned, local stack, you can like run AWS services on your laptop. It's one approach to it, bring production locally or bring production to your development environment. The other approach is the opposite. You put your development environment into the cloud, where you then basically fork everything that you have in production, and you have your cloud services are sitting in the exact same environment where your development code is. Another approach to it. But basically everyone who's putting a lot of investment into getting these great development environments does one of those two things. Or some combination of both, bringing production locally, or putting your local like into production in the sense of into your cloud environment.
Right, right. What's the barrier to entry for using something like Kurtosis?
Yeah. Right now, the biggest barrier to entry is defining the setup logic for your environment. So we have a definition language. We use Starlark, which is the language. It's a Python dialect that Bazel uses to define the build rules. We use it for similar properties that it has for the build system. You can determine that the program is going to halt because it's not a full computing language. But you need to define your setup logic in this language. And once you do it once, everyone else can reuse it. But what happens a lot of the time is, who knows how to do that? You have to, especially in an environment where there's a lot of different open source tooling being used to varying degrees of maturity. The person who has the expertise to understand how to spin it up in a variety of situations, that person might not be maintaining that project anymore, even. Right. So you have to track that down or relearn it somehow.
For sure, yeah. And then I think there's a related piece to that is not only building it, but then making sure, like reverse engineering, I guess, for a lack of a better term, to make sure that what you've built for your local dev tool actually mimics what's really going on out in production, right? Because there's a lot of different ways you can make all of these different components talk to each other, and you've got to try to replicate that.
Yes. And that's a lot of work. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people do opt to forego that whole process and just put their development code directly into a production-like cluster in the cloud as fast as possible. Because they're like, local is never going to be close enough to production. It's going to take a lot of never-ending effort to get it close. So let's just get to it, a staging cluster, as fast as possible. Let things soak there and then go to prod. It's another approach to it. There's benefits and cons to each one.
For sure, yeah. What are some of the big? First of all, how long have you been building Kurtosis?
Yeah, we've been doing this full time since December of 2020. So what is that now? 3 years and change?
Yeah. Cool. So what are some of how has your thought process changed in those 3+ years for building development environments? I mean, I'm sure you've learned lots of lessons and tried a lot of things that didn't quite work.
Absolutely. So a couple of things. First, we started out our company selling basically binaries. So one thing is, how do developers and development teams want to consume developer tooling? So we started out saying, we're going to sell a compiled binary that you get to run as a license fee. And our first couple of clients, we operated that way. And it was fine in the very beginning. We were solving a very important problem for those clients. It was acceptable at the time. But we very quickly learned that it's not the way that developers want to, and for really good reasons, want to be interacting with software. You do have to have the source code available. You do have to have a free license. You have to have a free period of trying it where they know, because you're integrating at a deep level with their tooling, if they're going to try it out, if they're going to invest into it, they do want to know it's not going to get yanked out from under them. And that's totally fair. So we changed our licensing entirely, made the repo open, and that changed everything about the rate at which we were learning, the rate of exposure to different developers, people able to try out the tool and get different perspectives. In retrospect, it was pretty obvious. Maybe a lot of these learnings are pretty obvious in retrospect. But that was maybe the biggest change that we had as a business, was opening the tool like that.
No, I think you're in good company. The past few weeks, months, I feel like there's been a huge shift in focus on the podcast. It keeps coming up. Will loves bringing up this point about selling your idea within the DevOps space as a product management challenge. So really understanding what teams need that are your consumers is difficult, but also really interesting and can help you build a great product for them.
Yeah, and it's developers are they're amazing users to work with, but it's a very different dynamic, I think, than products that maybe are selling to sales folks or business focused folks. The way that products are integrated, interacted with is quite different, and it's different dynamics. But once you're solving a problem that the developers really, really care about, you really do develop really deep relationships with the users, especially with like the community-based approach with like an open product. So it's been game-changing having that kind of a relationship working for us.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool point there, because you're talking about who your target market is. And so whenever you think about like production deployments, deploying my application to my target customers, that's a very different process than deploying my stack to the local development team so they can build on it. It's a different customer, and they have different goals and objectives. Like the consumers of my product want high availability, uptime, and fast response, whereas the developers want more granular access and the ability to tweak and turn the knobs across the environment to see how they can solve their problems. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. In fact, there's even 3 different profiles to consider. There's the developers that are the end users of the tool. There's we call it maybe the platform team, DevOps team, infra team. They're really the ones that are responsible for the implementation and configuration of the tool a lot of the times. They're the ones giving access to the GitHub repos. They're doing the high-level configuration administration of the installation. And they're concerned about the security posture and all that. And then ultimately, you also do have like the director or head of engineering, whoever approves the budget for whatever you're charging for an enterprise version. So there's three different concerns to worry about, and you have to think about each one differently. It's like when you think about like a minimal valuable product, like how many of the concerns of each of the 3 parties you really have to do to like get something off the ground. It's a multidimensional problem.
No one envies a startup founder. I mean, they do. They think you get to build your dream, but then you deal with these quite challenging situations where your buyers are not your users that you're really focused on. I have a question on that, actually. I feel like, and I know I'm gonna put myself in some bucket somewhere. I assume like everyone's using OpenTofu today. I mean, I know that's not the case, but maybe there's a huge audience there, especially if we talk about people that are in the quote unquote DevOps space. If they are familiar with this terminology, they probably are using some sort of infrastructure as code solution. We use extensively CloudFormation ourselves. How does that interact with Kurtosis here? Like, where are the touch points? Like, if we've already defined our infrastructure in, unfortunately, HCL, or worse, in a programming language that doesn't really well match to declarative nature, what do we do to spin up a dev environment?
Absolutely. So, right now, Kurtosis operates after you apply your OpenTofu or your Terraform scripts to spin up the cloud services that you would need for your development environment or your testing environment. You can think of it really as a abstraction layer over Kubernetes and Docker. So if you can use your Terraform scripts or OpenTofu to spin up your Kubernetes clusters and provision everything required there, and then deploy onto those clusters with Kurtosis.
I see.
Gotcha. And so then that's like a way to leverage some of the tools that you're using to deploy into production for building that, so you're not duplicating a lot of effort, right? So you can still leverage the learnings from Terraform or OpenTofu or any other production grade tools that you're deploying with.
Exactly. And then the cloud provisioning side of things is an area that we are now exploring, and it's not an area that's covered in the current like open tool and like the direct associates of the open tool, where it's, hey, can you also handle maybe forking my production environment in it, like as much as you could fork an environment? Can you handle cloning everything necessary there? Right now, that's a lot of what's happens in people's CloudFormation or Terraform scripts, is something like that. We haven't. That's an area that we're exploring right now, learning about, what's important when you're looking at designing those scripts.
Yeah, for sure. When it comes to documenting, like, because I think would be an important artifact of this process, is we've discovered how our production infrastructure is working. We've reverse engineered it. How do you approach documenting that so that when the next development team comes along, maybe the learning curve is a little bit not so sharp for them?
Yeah, right now I guess there's two ways to think about it. One is how much can you write? How much can you have your users write code that is somewhat self-documenting? So like, can the environment definition be the documentation?
Right.
And as much as possible, I like having code that is extraordinarily readable and seems self-documenting. And the way that our tool is set up, you tend to get that in the code. It tends to be very composable. It tends to be very readable. It tends to be very intuitive. So that's one function of it. Another function of it is the functionality that we offer. So we have high-level environment parameterizability. What that means is when you write your environment definition, you can expose very easily how to modify it in a sensible way. So you start it and you say, well, maybe I want to modify it this way, this way, this way. You don't need documentation for it, because when you run it with that configuration, you're going to get it out of the box. So you're trying to reduce the need for documentation as much as possible with the design of the definition language. But you can only reduce it so much, so that after that, it's traditional documentation. You got to rely on your users to write the READMEs, to write the docs for their specific systems.
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote that I heard a long, long time ago, back when everyone used to have wikis for documentation. And I worked with this one guy who said, yeah, the wiki is where the documentation goes to die. But I think like one of the cool things I think that's happened is, if you've ever used Jupyter Notebooks, I love the way that they let you mix, different syntax in there. So you can have like a markdown block and then a code block. And so you can kind of integrate the documentation alongside the code. And I think for iterative or interactive type environments like that, it works really well, because it then lets you keep everything in one place. Because when you try to update multiple places, it just never happens in reality.
Yeah, and I love Jupyter Notebooks. The experience, like, it's one of my favorite dev access in the world, is like spinning up and hacking something together in a Jupyter Notebook. And the dream is to feel that way about all of my development work. I'm not sure it's realistic, but I love that experience.
I mean, that's an interesting thread. What would the world have to look like that regular development could follow this sort of path here? Is it a matter of what we're working on, or can we already sort of start doing that today?
Yeah, I mean, what's great about it? Like, one thing that's great is how fast you see your changes work. It's like extraordinarily fast. You write it, run, and you get the feedback right away. That's the build deploy. Like, how the build deploy loop is like, how fast does it take for you to see on real stuff what your things look like? Usually in Jupyter Notebooks, you're using, I mean, like, a lot of the fun use cases for it are running on relatively small data sets, so it fits in memory. So you can get that fast speed build deploy loop. And that's just tricky to get. Like, you can get it with like hot reloading into containers that are running in your dev environment. You can get decently close to it, but you're still stuck at the level of like, what is the smallest build increment that you can like define for your backend system? I know a lot of people spend a lot of effort getting their basal build rules so well defined that they're going to like minimize the build deploy loop as much as possible, but that takes a lot of effort. You really have to look into it to get that experience.
I mean,
I'm not sure that there's a really good way to get that now.
No, for sure not. But I think, tools like yours, definitely help reduce the loop here, which is like the most important aspect, because no matter how much time you spend, really every second you cut off your loop allows that feedback to happen faster, which improves the time. I think it's a hackneyed response now that realistically people waiting for software development is what makes them unhappy. Right? If you have to wait for the response, Will said, he's all about the instant gratification. There's nothing better than, hitting F5 and having your program instantly work or tell you what you did wrong.
Which is, I don't think it's just me. I'm convinced that we are a TikTok generation. Whether you're a TikTok user or not, we've all gotten addicted to short form content. If you're going to do anything that requires an attention span of over 60 seconds, you really have to engineer for that.
And we've been digging a lot into this little that little feedback loop there. And one thing that like the dream world, there's kind of two really important things. One is getting that build deploy loop super fast. So you're coding, you see the change, coding, see the change. The other one is when you see the change, how close is the change that you're seeing to what would happen in production? And like, can you get both of those things maximized? So like you're getting a really fast build deploy loop, but also the deployment is safely, basically in production when you're doing it. That's kind of the dream world. It would take a lot to get there, I think, all the way, but you kind of like roughly what's happening, I think, with the more and more sophisticated like dev infra along the software development lifecycle, roughly what's happening is you're getting like more and more optimized on both of those axes to the point that eventually it kind of feels like you're doing that to like the limit of what's possible.
I think there's a sort of a conundrum here where the providers that are offering production infrastructure or platforms, the amount of money that you're paying into them is so large or so vast for the environment you're running for production that it never makes sense. It's not something that is ever justified for them to make it faster to run or get the loop closed because they don't care. It's like how much does your test staging fake ephemeral environment cost in actual dollars, euros, pesos, whatever, compared to production? It's like what, 1% less even. So like Amazon, Google, GCP platforms of the world, they're not going to make anything there. And so I feel like it would be on them to really change that because that's sort of like the canonical interface that you have to abstract or make the same as much as possible.
Yes, absolutely. And basically everyone's working against that limitation, as far as I can tell. It's like that's the blocker. The only way to like you're basically just trying to design more and more like innovative solutions to get around exactly that obstacle.
Yeah, because let's be just like completely transparent here. The gold standard is Vim on the production server.
Yes.
You say that. I feel like that's where I started my career, actually.
Right? For sure.
I was working at a company where you did software development by SSHing into another server somewhere, and there was an environment running there, which then you logged into, and you literally changed production objects by opening a text editor there. It wasn't Vim. That would have been slightly better than what was being used. And then changing them. And then you had to record the changes you made in a overgrown internal system that would somehow get those changes applied to actual production when there was a release. So, I really do feel like what was old will be new again. And I honestly don't know if I want that world.
My introduction to programming was doing something very similar to that. And the guy who showed me how to do it, he's like, okay, when you get here, you want to run the ls command, and you could see all of the files there. But then it was like, for any given file, just say like main.c, there was main.c.1, main.c.2, main.c.3. It's like, so you want to look and see what the biggest number here is and copy main.c to the next number so that if you screw anything up, you've got a backup for it. And that was our version control system.
Oh no. I'm just like, I think people figured out date-based, right? None of these fancy tools. All you need to do is append the timestamp of the last time you edited the file there, and then you'd be good.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Vim on the production server. At least for me, this is like clearly the best DevX. Like I love it. I love it. It's just dangerous. It's super dangerous, and like staying up all night to take care of an outage is miserable. So that experience is not great. But the feeling of the Vim directly to production is the ideal. So like, to what degree can you mitigate risk to get as close to that as possible?
I mean, you said it, right? Things like kurtosis, shortening the gap there on time to make a change so that rather than Vim on the production server, it's Vim on your machine, or, using one of those better tools that's out there. And then making that change, and just immediately that gets to a clone of production that is almost exactly the same. And you can see that change running as if you had actually applied it, and then get all the benefits without having actually the danger of making a production change.
Yes, absolutely. That's the dream.
That's the dream.
Yes.
So what is the learning curve for someone who's just they've done the 7,000 line bash script and they're looking for something different and wanting to check out kurtosis? What's the learning curve or the amount of time it takes to be productive with this?
So as framed, very low. And the reason for that is because that person did the 7,000 line bash script. So they did the hard part. They did the hard part. They figured out how it all works together. They figured out what needs to be scripted. They figured out all of this hard stuff. That learning curve is extraordinarily low. I mean, in kurtosis, you're using a Python-like dialect. Most people are familiar with Python. The set of, functions and tools you have are very basic. Half a day to just rewrite it in something that's cleaner, and then it's going to take you a lot further. It's probably about what you're going to get. Now, the part that's frustrating for us, and we're trying to figure out how to make this better, is what if you haven't written the 7,000 line bash script? Then what do? You're saying, okay, someone else wrote the 7,000 line bash script. I don't understand it yet, but I want to get all these benefits that I can get from kurtosis. Now we have a really big learning curve, but the learning curve is mostly inside of the bash script side.
Interesting.
For sure. And then, can you give us like some success stories of like different problems that customers have solved? I always think that's kind of cool because then it gives us something that we can like resonate with and be like, oh yeah, I remember when I had to do that. Like, what are some cool things that you've seen people do with kurtosis?
Well, I feel like your whole work experience history here, just recount those things, and it'd be like, yeah, solve.
Yeah, my career could be a Forrest Gump story in tech.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest and like the most proud use case that we have for kurtosis is what the Ethereum Foundation is doing with kurtosis. That's probably the thing that it's the most incredible thing. So for folks who aren't like deep into the blockchain ecosystem, the Ethereum mainnet, so it's like the production deployment of Ethereum, is now extraordinarily complicated. There's like 20 different open source components that have to get spun up together. There's no centralized DevOps team for this. So it's all different people running their own different service with loose communication between them. What they're using kurtosis to, the Ethereum Foundation, is to package all of that together in a one-line run with high-level configurability. So you can say, hey, I want to run it with this topology, like these clients and these clients, and it works remarkably well. It works remarkably well. It's a large degree of complexity. The bash, I don't know what it would look like if we like unfolded it into the bash script scenario that you described, it would be very remarkable. But now this thing, it runs to, you can one-click replicated Ethereum mainnet on your laptop or inside of one of your cloud boxes or over a Kubernetes cluster at scale. So you can kind of hit the dev all the way to late stage testing, performance testing. There was a team that built, it's basically like a SAD path testing on top of this tool. So like attack the network, perturb it in lots of different crazy ways. I guess you call it chaos testing on top of this. And it takes you all the way almost to deploying to prod if you're going to make like a big change in the deep layers of the network. So that's the thing I'm the most proud of when it comes to like what our tool has been able to do. There's a large degree of DevOps complexity encapsulated in that project. And then there's a bunch of people using it to do some really cool things on top of it.
I feel like that makes a lot of sense there as well. Like when you have a lot of different testing scenarios that need to be captured and the configurability for them is also determined sort of by the constraints of the test, then you have a huge dimensionality of the data and configuration that you need to specify to actually execute it there. Whereas I feel like, in some other environments that may not be like always the case, but in this one, like, yeah, for sure, I can totally imagine, especially given the fact that it's there is no official production environment where cloud provider where Ethereum is running on.
Exactly, and it happens in cases where you're doing a lot of different testing things, and it also happens when you're, I guess you could call it like a feature branch environment. It's these situations where you're like pre-merge and you want to spin up a representation environment that's specific to. You're not really deving on it because it's not inside of your like build and run loop as you're in your IDE, but it's kind of close to like your dev because you're not ready to put it into CI yet. That situation as well is one where inside of an organization or an open source community, you might have hundreds of those a week of slightly different configurations. So it's either easy to configure or it's not, but if it's not, like this is a great way to do it.
This gives me sort of PTSD flashbacks to the previous environment that I was working in, where there was like different production environments that we had because they were for different customers or different internal business units. And then we had copies of them that were test environments that were supposed to match the production one, because realistically, given the ridiculous amount of configuration, you almost needed to run your tests in every single sort of clone of production, however it could be possibly configured. And then of course there was a problem where like the actual switches from production didn't match what were in your testing environment. And so you had, not only did you have to run your test in all of these fake versions of production, but also make some changes. That for sure was quite the nightmare.
And there's a mode of thought that I'm honestly a fan of this movement. There's a mode of thought where you just say, can we forego all of that and just make shipping to production as safe as possible and do all of it like test in production? That mode of thought is like sometimes possible. I think that's like Honeycomb's big motto. They're an observability tool. Yeah. They're like test in production. We're just going to give you really good monitoring tooling, so the moment something goes wrong, you can catch it right away before it impacts your entire customer base. Roll back. Like some products, I guess, can do this. Other ones, a tiny little bug is disastrous. Like medical tooling or something. I don't know. Like I want to do it.
For sure, sign me up. I mean, we're in the at Authorist with the 5.9 SLA, where for sure we can't let stuff go through. I think the biggest challenge is, depending on what your business is actually like, what the business logic looks like. The fear I've always had with these sort of automatic rollbacks in a lot of cases, where what happens if the problem is compounded by changing the database version? And I always keep getting back to the Knight Capital $440 million loss in 45 minutes, because like the ridiculous thing is they had the wrong version of the software only running on one machine, and they made it worse by restarting the cluster. Like if they hadn't restarted anything, it would have been fine. And they assumed that the problem was with the rollout. So they rolled back everything and then also compounded the issue. And it's those things that really scare me. And I would so totally be for if the automatic rollback could calculate whether or not the database is at fault and also include that. And I feel like I'm not going to see that in my lifetime.
I don't know. To me, it just sounds like we're making excuses to keep from giving people Vim access to the production server.
I mean, you're I think in control of that actually at Polygon, right? Well, like you could just go and turn that on and let that happen. And you could be like, it could be the real case study. You could do that, write it up, whether it was a success, publish that blog post, that you're doing this, why it's so great. And, you could get people on board with it.
And then next week's episode will be reviewing my resume because I'm looking for a job.
I'll never forget that article that was published by GitLab about how they, accidentally deleted their production database. It was like a decade ago now. I was like, oops, like I ran this command and I thought I was on the replication server and I was actually in production.
Oh, I've done that.
Remarkably easy to do.
Yeah. It was in AWS and I thought that I was on the staging environment and just dropped an entire database cluster.
Oh, that's not that bad, right? I mean, you just restore back from the one that you got snapshotted from an hour ago. Like it's much worse when you write that update statement in SQL and forget the select that comes after it, right? People say you should write that first, like write the from statement first and then change your select to an update.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous that those mistakes can be made. But I think at every company I've been at, there's been a special name for that. Like, oh, don't 84 the database because like that's just happened to be what the update was where someone didn't configure the restriction correctly. And now there's some column with this wrong value in it. And it's so noticeable too, right? Like it's not like, oh, database is gone, let's fix that. It's, oh, when did someone change the name of all of our customers to 84?
I mean, that's kind of like a badge of honor though. Like if you were the person who implemented 84, like would you put that on your LinkedIn? So yeah, I'm that guy.
I think that was my biggest fear when I started my engineering career was doing one of these things, like terrified of touching anything that could look and feel something like deleting a production database. And I think it is a badge of honor. It's the moment when you realize, like, once you do something like this, hopefully to a smaller scale, you kind of learn, like, this is a process issue. Like, I never should have been able to do it. Shouldn't have been a risk that I would do this. But when you start out, you feel I'm gonna get fired if I do one thing wrong.
Yeah, and it's one of those things. I don't think you can communicate that. I think the only way to learn that is to earn that badge.
This is a failure everyone has to go through in your life. Suffer that trauma. You'll live with the PTSD from that moment on about how the larger system, because you've gained more experience at this time, you're in a more important position, your impact to the company is obviously going to be higher. You'll never make that same mistake again. Yeah.
It's like riding a bike. Like you don't really understand the pros and cons of riding a bike until you face plant into the side of your house. And you're like, oh, gotcha, brakes.
It was a mailbox for me.
Cool. So let's talk about, we talk about mimicking the production environment, and production environments are always changing with, updated code and updates to the database and sometimes breaking changes, especially since we've been talking about databases, like breaking schema changes. With Kurtosis, how do you make sure that those production changes get integrated back into the local dev tool environments?
Yeah, right now that's something the end user has to configure. We're looking into ways to get this to provide like a productized way to automatically get this. But right now, when it comes to production change, my dev environment has to update to it. You gotta you got to have a process in place to check out updating the configurations. Ideally, what you do is any time that you make a production change, it goes through your Kurtosa setup first. That's the ideal scenario, but it's not always going to happen that way, of course.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I imagine that you're making the database changes in your source code anyway to run a migration if it's schema'd, or if it's schemaless, you're making the code changes that are associated. And you can just refresh your dev environment, like, blow it away and start fresh, because the migration should just not even need to be run potentially, and it would just be the same as production. At least that would be my hope.
Yes. It's it gets goofy when people do things like hot fixes, where like other people hot fix stuff and you never looked at it. It can get goofy, but happy path scenario, it's not that hard to get it back up to date.
These are where these experiences are important. I remember having to do a production fix. And at the time, that meant that a different team created a SVN feature branch for us. It was a hot patch production. And I ended up with this problem where there was code that should have worked in production, but it didn't play nicely with what was there. And, I compared it to what was actually in dev, and it didn't match. And what I had found out is that there could be multiple production fixes that had to be done at the same time. And merging an SVN didn't really work that well. And what would happen is you would get merge conflicts there. And this team that was not the development team or knew how the features should actually work was going and actually doing the merge conflict resolution themselves and pushing that out. And that was a very horrifying learning experience for me.
I think I'd rather drop the production database.
I mean, you don't even have the code to look at to know what the issue was, because I had to go find these other branches that weren't merged to production and merge them into my code and see, it still wasn't right. Where is this wrong code? It just didn't exist anywhere. And then of course you have the incident response team coming to your desk, because in these days, of course, you had to be in the office, and asking you, why are we losing $100,000 every minute because of this problem? I'm I have literally no idea what is going on. Oops.
Yeah, that's always cool too. That's just another fun experience of being able to quantify the cost of downtime. Oh, wow, this is serious. I feel bad.
Enough to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and never be away from your computer in case something happens there.
Right? That's the solution.
I do
24/7 with Vim on the production server.
Yeah, it's just gonna keep. If you keep bringing that up, I'm gonna be write down this in my notebook. See when Will's got this product ready to go, where it will let you. It uses maybe SSH under the hood or your IDE. Just be called Vim in production. You can even it lends itself a name, VIP, right? We'll see where that goes, right?
I'm just going to keep campaigning it till they let me give a talk at Platform Con about how to do this.
Well, you know how to get accepted to those conferences. What you do is you first just say you've done it, and then if you get accepted, then you'll have to come up with a whole product and actually try it out and then present it.
We're just full of useful tips today.
I really like this idea of getting a tool in the mix here for helping build out the dev environment for real.
Yeah, and if you to help illustrate the scale of this, with your success with the Ethereum Foundation, that's a monster project with completely open source, And so I'm assuming that if I wanted to contribute to the Ethereum project, quit laughing, Warren. It could happen.
It could happen. I thought you were going to ask for access to, update this tool, and now I'd be like, well, if Will's, making changes to it, I'm not sure
No, but if I wanted to contribute to Ethereum, I could use Kurtosis to build my local dev environment, which helps me write the code, test it, and then create a pull or open a pull request, it's going to be more likely to meet their contribution guidelines. Is that a fair statement?
It's, I mean, it probably is the easiest way to do that. Yeah.
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 Versus the alternative prior to, because I worked with Ethereum before they started adopting kurtosis. Like prior to that, it was like 20 or 30 steps to get this thing running, where you were downloading from all these different repositories, then you were compiling it, and then you had to figure out in the config files which parts you had to change to make these different things that you just compiled, but you weren't really sure what they were, talk to each other. And so, yeah, this, like, having this type of solution makes it easier. And that could be another benefit for you, especially if you're an open source project, making it easier for people to contribute to your product.
There's actually a good rule of thumb for when an open source project or community would benefit from using kurtosis. And it's when you go to the docs and it says how to run locally, if it's like the longer that thing is, the better you're going to get. It's kind of the general rule of thumb, is how long is that thing. So yeah, for the Ethereum, it was huge. There's the general rule of thumb is that's pretty much how it works. And it is helpful for contributing. It's most of our implementations are open source entirely. So it's people contributing back to those people that use them, putting things back, getting more options available, and that really, really helps because our team doesn't have time to handle all of the different scenarios when we start building examples and everything. So having people contribute back is so the Ethereum package. It's called a package. The definition of how to spin up an environment. The Ethereum package, it really is a remarkable work of open source contributions coming back. They're very, very engaged users.
I think you touched on this a little bit earlier on about first you were in the licensing model and then you changed off of that. Like if someone's going to get started today with this, is it I install a CLI and write a configuration file? Is there a hosted version? Like are these packages available and you'll deploy them automatically to my cloud environment? What does this look like?
There's actually two versions right now. The standard way is download the CLI via Homebrew or apt-get or whatever is your preferred installation thing. Most people who they're starting because they see a package they want to run. So most people, they're just running a package when they start to see how it spins up. And then they start modifying that package if they want to modify it, or they're like, hey, this is cool. I'm going to write my own for my own system. And it's all happens on your own laptop and your own hardware, and you just run with it and go. And then we do have a cloud right now that we host where, hey, let's say you don't want to download the CLI and you don't want to be using your own compute to be running the environment. You can just button click. It's like a no-code interface to run any existing package. There's also a no-code interface for modifying the package to a certain degree. That's evolving, so you can get more and more power over modifying it. And then once you're excited about it, you can write your own package, and then you can deploy that there as well.
And then the packages, are those the ones that end up showing up in the kurtosis catalog?
Yes.
Yeah, because the kurtosis catalog is actually really cool. Specifically, if you going back to the Ethereum example, you can just grab that from the catalog and it runs for you, right? And then there's actually quite a few out there in your catalog. One that I happen to know of is the Polygon CDK, as of last week, just went up in the catalog. So if you want to run that, just grab it from the catalog and there you go.
Interesting.
Yeah, they're right there. And the way the catalog works right now is it scans public GitHub. So if it's an open source package, it's going to get detected and populated into the catalog, and then you can just run it because it's an open source. It's an open source tool. So with the Polygon CDK, for example, the Polygon team put a lot of work into getting the package in a very nice format, and now it's there, and you can just button click run it. And one of the most exciting things about having made this step of opening everything is that we're seeing stuff happen without us knowing it or tracking it too closely. So like, oh, look at what the Polygon team has done. This is amazing. And that's very exciting.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's Because y'all are completely open source as well, right?
So the tool is actually the BSL license.
Okay.
Source available.
Gotcha.
You can do everything except for recreate our cloud offering on it.
Which seems like a fair constraint.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, no, but I think that's really cool having the catalog there, especially with the open source communities. And it seems that kurtosis is really resonating there to make it easy for people to just run and then contribute and then improve your product in a consistent format, because I think that's one of the biggest challenges of running an open source project is verifying or vetting out the contributions that you get to make sure that they have done what in some cases is just tribal knowledge.
Yes, and it's one thing we're noticing, especially as we work with more and more people who have cloud dependencies, is the more that your system is composed of open source components, the more this problem is important to you, because you're dealing with a bunch of different software components built by different organizations where you can run that entire software component yourself. That's the whole point of the open source. So you don't have the issue of, cloud provider runs a production environment, has zero incentive to make you able to modify it or move it. In the open source community, it's not the case. You actually can do it entirely. So the more open source your tool is in terms of the percentage of services that are involved in your environment, which are open source, the more you get this benefit of how do we verify that the contribution is gonna work and make sense, and you do kind of have to run it all to see it. Yeah.
I mean, I would even take it further, honestly, that most open source solutions out there that aren't using a strategy or have a strategy for easy for contributors to come in and run the software would benefit a lot from a strategy like this, because realistically, if you go out there and find an open source solution, no matter what it is, even one used by thousands of organizations, it is quite the challenge to get that up and running. Even if it's a Docker container, even if it's, in a registry, it's still, there's a lot that goes on with it. I remember it was even recently that you didn't need Zookeeper anymore to run Kafka. It was always this sort of mess that if you ever wanted to run Kafka yourself, you needed 3 different services running on your machine with multiple nodes and clusters at the same time in order to even test this out. And I'm like, what?
Yes, it's a big issue, and it's for the most part, in my opinion, it's a bit of a silent issue, because if you're contributing back to an open source project, a lot of the time you're doing it out of almost like a hobby mentality. It's I want to help this project. I'm interested in it. If there's a really big friction bar for me to do that, I'm not getting paid to contribute back to it. That's the whole idea. So I'm not going to put an inordinate amount of effort into knocking down the door to say make my testing environment better, or make my dev environment better. I'm just going to disappear. So the amount of open source contributions that you're missing because people just got frustrated in the first 5 minutes and said, you know what, someone else is going to handle this contribution at some point, hopefully, is just imagine the velocity that you're losing there.
I mean, I hope that's really the case, that's even where they're falling off. I find that unfortunately, the state of the open source today is you find an issue out there, or you want to even make a change, and you may open an issue or open that pull request and just never hear back. And with stuff like this, that the team has invested in what that experience is on building stuff up. So it could be a badge of honor, really, to say this open source project is using kurtosis or another tool that makes this experience better, because they thought about it, that they care about getting those contributions in.
So is there a thought pattern behind, whenever we talk about production servers with the whole DevOps movement, we kind of came up with this philosophy of servers are cattle, not pets, referring to the fact that they should be short-lived and you shouldn't have emotional attachment to them. You shouldn't be hand curating them. But I feel like dev environments maybe didn't fall under that umbrella. Is there a thought process or something that you've noticed through kurtosis where you kind of see people shifting away from long-lived development environments because it's a little easier and standardized to bring them up now?
I don't know if I would say that it's a shift away from it. It's in some ways it is for certain use cases. Like, so how could I describe this? One thing kurtosis does is if you run your integration tests in CI inside of kurtosis, it's quite easy to rerun that locally in your laptop. So if you want to debug a failing integration or end-to-end test, rather than recreating it in a remote cluster that's like a shared cluster, you would just rerun it on your laptop. And in that case, there's a shift towards ephemeral environments. Like you're just for dev, like you're just rerunning Fusion. But there's also people who are like, I'm going to use kurtosis to set up a persistent development environment because the other devs on my team, it's just significantly easier for them to ping an endpoint that's sitting there stable and to get into that than even to like download a tool and then rerun some commands every single time. And then you get into the problem of like data management. So if you've invested in your dev environment, having a particular data set behind it that's useful for that dev project, and then investing the extra effort into cloning and moving that data for an ephemeral use case, it often doesn't make sense. You just use the same thing. So I think it really is dependent on the use case. But there definitely is a meaningful difference between how you treat your dev servers and your prod servers. So like the cattle not pets thing, I think it's totally fine for your dev server to be a pet. Like there's times when it makes a lot of sense. The moment you want to see that it looks like prod, you do kind of want to turn it into a cattle just to see how it works. But there's a lot of compelling reasons to treat it like a pet, especially if you are debugging an issue or trying to figure out the way things kind of work. You want to have that state sitting around and you want to really preserve that because it's going to take you some time thinking and creative time to work with it. And if it's a cattle and you lose it halfway through your work, it's miserable. You got to restart.
Right on. I think I heard you say that there's a use case here for using something like kurtosis to create a persistent dev environment that provides a common set of services for your dev team to access. So not everyone has to run that locally, but there's one that's centrally available for them that maybe has a specific configuration or has something unique to it that everyone needs to be thinking about or addressing in their local development efforts. So you just provide that as a shared service for everyone.
Yes, and that's useful for a lot of development workflows, but then there's another set of development workflows where you're going to say, I actually do want to isolate for an ephemeral purpose a particular set of microservices or data set, and I want that to be my sandbox that nobody else is touching. And that happens a lot as well because it's like, hey, what if 3 different teams want to use the dev cluster and they're all hating each other, and then you have to go on Slack and say, hey, wait a minute, like let me use it for the next 2 hours so you guys can stop. And then you blow away their work and it's miserable. But that's only sometimes. So the best world is you have the choice. When you need to get the isolation, you can get it quite easily. When you don't need it, you can use other people's work. And that's the direction we're trying to go towards is how do we provide like high level. You want it to feel like you're in Harry Potter and you have a wand and you're just like, and you have the thing you need. Like that's the highest level user experience that you want to get to. It's like cool, but how do you design the wand such that you can do that? And I think you just want to have the configurability to be able to pick which, in this scenario, I want the shared dev cluster or I want the isolated ephemeral one.
Right on. So continuing on that thought, what does the future of kurtosis look like? In addition to that, what are some of the things that you would like to see getting implemented? Absolutely.
So as I said before, it's right now kurtosis operates to, you have your Terraform scripts or your OpenTofu, and it deploys your provisions your hardware, so to speak, and maybe your virtualization layer like the Kubernetes cluster or Docker engine, and then kurtosis deploys on top of that. Mm-hmm. we want Kurtosis to move in a direction where you no longer have to do that first part. You no longer have to think about and dig into like, how do I split my cloud assets over? How do I provision my hardware? We want to get better and better and better at providing tools to not have to worry about that. So that's where we're going. The more that the folks in the blockchain space, they use a lot of open source tools where it's just all can be containerized and you get everything in the container. The more that you're working with folks who have reliances on like AWS services or managed authentication services and this kind of thing, the more that abstraction is not so useful anymore, because those are the issues. The issues of cloud stuff. So the more that we can build an abstraction layer that captures that stuff in a way that's useful, that's where we want to go, and that's where we're doing all this research. And that's where this thought experiment of like, well, to some degree, you're limited by the cloud provider allowing you to easily get like everything forked over. To some degree, you have those limitations. So then, given that's the world we live in, how do we get as close as possible? And that's kind of the design work that we're looking at right now.
Well, I think there's totally a gap here in the IAC world where it doesn't feel like any of the offerings are super compelling. I think anyone that assigns themselves a DevOps title has a unique perspective on complaining about literally everything that exists. So, of course, the tools that we have, are not as good as they should be. And I think there's always a space for someone to say, I wrote a better Terraform or whatever, because I feel like that's sort of the abstraction layer that exists over the cloud providers. And I'm not saying that anyone should go and create a new IAC tool. I'm sure someone just got that idea, right? Well, you can do that. You absolutely can do that and wrap the SDKs out there. But I do feel like that there is definitely room here to grow in that direction.
Yeah, and that's it's kind of maybe not a fork in the road, but the two different philosophies is like create that layer so that it's very easy to do those forks. The other one is, I guess you could call it like the honeycomb or the launch darkly philosophy, where it's like, can you build tools that make production just safer, like feature flags? So now just don't worry about testing or like so much. Just get it to production under a feature flag, and then just turn it on for a certain set of customers, and then you'll figure out how things work. Or like the observability thing, instead of focusing so much on like forking your staging and testing environment, you just go into production. We're going to monitor everything so closely that we're going to minimize any kind of damage. And I think there's gaps on both sides, and the different engineering leaders and platform leaders have different opinions about which way they want to go. So it's kind of lots of different takes on how.
I mean, I definitely have an opinion on that. Realistically, it would be nice if we could get to that world. I don't think the cloud providers offer us the sort of control over the environment that would allow us to perform like 1 out of every million requests. Yeah, go and change this. I just feel like we're much better off pulling production down to another environment to validate that the code that we have is exactly executing as we want, and we can do it, creating synthetic requests from our production environment and replicating that against the ephemeral dynamically created dev one.
Well, this is a perfect example of what we're seeing is Warren, who is like, let's get things synthetically mocked, let's get everything running locally, let's get it as close as possible and make sure things work. And then we have Will, who wants Vim on prod.
Team Vim right here.
I think both are valid approaches. They're both valid approaches. People have different appetites for what they want to do.
No, I mean, there's still definitely things where I'm a huge proponent of pushing stuff to testing in production. And we do that under certain circumstances where we make sure that we've wrapped, like parallel execution is a huge thing for us. When we're changing some of the business logic of how something works, we'll usually execute 2 different paths actually simultaneously in production and validate whether or not the outcome is exactly as it should be, and before turning off the legacy one.
And when you do that, does the output still go back to like you fork traffic, or do you?
No, it's in process. Like basically the equivalent of having 2 threads. You call this method and it does two things at the same time, and then we throw away the new result until we validate it, and then we throw it away. And if we get any invalidations, then that's an alert that someone goes and looks at and comes back and says, okay, you know what happened here. And if we don't get any alerts after a period of time, then that sort of level of testing has been completed, and we can just delete the old code and actually return the new stuff.
I love that setup. I think that's great. I think that's like decently. I mean, it's a far cry from like Vim and prod, but like it's almost a step towards that, right? It's like you're at least able to get something into production more safely, even though I imagine there's constraints on like you wouldn't be able to do that if there was like very secure data that was going into the response that you shouldn't see. You wouldn't be able to validate it that well.
Well, I mean, we sort of had that because we're an identity provider, federated and aggregation, and no one sees the data. It's just, hey, there's something here that doesn't match, and you can sort of revalidate that. And realistically, the actual who the user is doesn't really matter in those circumstances. You can just sort of see what it looks like. If for some reason there is some concern, we encrypt the logs that get written even before they leave the production environment. We hash the data that will get seen automatically by any of our engineers before it leaves. So, I mean, very rarely it's the case that like what someone's last name was relevant for us.
That's a very cool setup. I like that.
So that's some discipline there, though. Like that sounds to me like a very disciplined approach, because you're being very deliberate about what you're testing, writing that second path for it, and then you're having to specifically define and measure what the success criteria for that is.
Well, that's a very charitable way of looking at it.
Maybe that's my naive assumption. Like, no, we don't do that at all.
I mean, there was definitely a time in my life where I'm like, you're releasing that code to production. Why is there an arbitrary try-catch block, around that? But there is another aspect here if you care about reliability and that your stuff doesn't really go down in production and the code you're changing, like there are too many unknowns there, realistically. You didn't test literally every case. And sometimes it's not so critical that you have tested everything, but validating something happens in production. Like, oh, we don't know if a customer is using this. Well, you can at least create a log message that says, hey, customer is using this thing, don't turn it off yet, and run that for a bunch of weeks so that you have the data to validate.
Console.log here.
You laugh, but if you don't take that first step, like this is absolutely the advice that someone could be utilizing to improve their decision-making capability. Not like some spreadsheet with a list of features that are on or off per customer, but really like what is happening in your production environment. And this is just the next level after that, which is release the code, have multiple versions running at the same time, measure performance, reliability, consistency, whatever that is. This is just how we've happened to be doing it. And I feel like it works really well for us, unfortunately. So, we're not going to migrate to something else. I don't know. I haven't heard anyone else doing something that, really changes this. I mean, there's blue-green deployments, right, where you're siphoning traffic off from your new version. Sometimes it just doesn't really make sense a lot when you have a lot of features going to production over time, where the features especially aren't interacting with each other. Having them wait in a queue to get through this and then deciding to roll back or not is a huge expensive process. As you said, feature flags can work here, although that's again a switch. So really parallel execution has been the only thing I can think of that really made sense for us early on.
And how do you think about how that compares to like a canary environment?
I mean, this is sort of the same thing. Like if you have millions of requests that are coming into your service all the time, then some number of people would be affected by any change, no matter how small. And if you have the error budget, which is one of the key terms that we talk a lot about in observability, then go for it, right? You don't need to take some extra steps. But if it's just a matter of changing a bunch of parameters somewhere and you want to see how it validates it, especially when you have all the business logic on your side already, right? You're not calling a third-party service, you're not doing some other things. Like if you can really test it all in your service in production at runtime, why not do this to validate?
Wow. Was that hard to set up?
I mean, you really think of, you're changing a method, any engineer out there, you're changing the internals of some method. all you need to do is duplicate that method down to a second block, call it V2, and have the caller execute both of those things. Wrap the other one in a try-catch block, and then validate the outputs in your code. And if it doesn't work, log a message. And it's honestly not a lot there. You can create some structure and around that with a framework where you can wrap, parallel execution and then pass it in two methods and have it automatically do it. It's not a lot of extra overhead if you feel like you're doing this very, very often. I think this happens like 1 out of 10 features that gets implemented goes in like this. It also gives us some security around it. So I wouldn't say it's complicated. I think a lot of engineers know that this is a way that you can test, and this helps. I think junior engineers, they navigate to this, right? Throw a try-catch around there. I'm scared about this affecting production. I think bringing that fear back in, it, helps us. Thinking that our code that we write is invincible is the problem here.
Yes.
So
can you just share your screen for us, Warren? I'm kidding.
It's really boring right now. I mean, when I'm doing the podcast, I literally have a notes page and my audio equipment UI up and running, and that's it. There's nothing else on my desktop right now.
We are completely different. I never close Windows and never reboot.
That's exactly what somebody who wants Vim on prod would say. Well,
right. I saw a meme yesterday and it cracked me up, and it said, damn, I just accidentally closed that browser tab that I've been meaning to read for 2 years.
I was very careful about my usage there. That Control-Shift-T brings that up, or the previous window that I've closed.
Right.
I restart all my tabs. Yeah, no, for sure. That, like, I was using X marks on Firefox back in the day before they bought into it, because it's just so critical for me that I can actually get that. The worst one I have is emails in my inbox, because when you click archive accidentally or delete, like if that email was months old, good luck finding what that was.
We have a security policy that automatically deletes our emails after a specified period of time. So email management is automated for me. Cool. So on kurtosis, have you found an area where it's not a good fit?
Yes, definitely. With kurtosis, with where we are right now, if you are able to very adequately express your system with a Docker Compose file or a Helm chart, with a relatively small Helm chart, in the sense of like your Helm chart repo doesn't have 7,000 lines in it. It's got like, the same number of configuration settings. If you have those two things, you're doing great. Kurtosis is not going to be great for you. It's the situation where those things have to be augmented by the 7,000 line bash script, the bunch of different documentations on how to configure these things. If your Docker Compose file has, or your Helm charts have a bunch of lines commented out that say, if you want this behavior, please uncomment these lines, and it's like all over the place. That's where you should take a look at kurtosis, and that's where we're going to provide a lot of value at the moment.
Right on. Excellent. So you mentioned Docker Compose and Helm. So I think I can safely infer there that you're a big favor of containerization.
Yes.
Is that specific, or is that a result of like this is what you learned from your customers, or from the beginning where you just like containers all the way?
I mean, I would love to say it was entirely deliberate from like the very beginning. Definitely in the beginning, it was like, hey, this is the standard that people are using to ship these things. I think it's a great abstraction. I think it's wonderful to embrace the world of containers. I think right now when people think about containers, they often also think about the Docker runtime, the Docker build process. And so like think of a container, they're thinking about not only like the idea of the container, but also like what does it look and feel like when you build everything inside of a Docker file, which is like separate from having a container. So like what I love is the container abstraction. I don't so much love. It's very easy to bloat a Docker file. It's very easy to bloat a container so that it's like significantly bigger than it really needs to be. There's a lot of stuff to improve there. But when it comes to like how you wrap things up, the ideal world is like containers as lightweight as possible. Wonderful. The only issue is it is pretty annoying to get in and out of containers and deal with the, like, is this a port that is exposed inside of the container, or is it on my laptop, or is it like which port is it at what level of networking? It's pretty annoying, and it can be also difficult to map between file systems in different containers to your own file system when you have mounts mapped or not. That stuff can be tricky. A lot of the abstraction that we provide in our like runtime tries to make that stuff better when it comes to interacting with the dev environment. But I think really the reaction folks have against containers when it comes to dev environments, a lot of the time it comes from them being perceived as heavyweight, which is often true. If you're running a Docker company, it often is true. It's like there's a lot of stuff going on there, but a lot of the time it doesn't have to be heavyweight. It's just that the way we build containers now tends to lean towards a more heavyweight approach.
No, I think you nailed it there. Realistically, it's like this. There's no hot reload automation when you make a code change. How do you get the necessary like auto compiling and run? Like you just want to sort of debug it as soon as possible.
Yes.
I think that's a small, like that's some set of things. And then there's this other set, which you for sure mentioned, like what if you're changing something at the container level, right? Like you're definitely gonna make some changes and you're gonna need to test that in some way. I don't think I know anyone that wrote a Docker file and it was right the first time, or the second time, or the third time. I did learn about this thing that you can like now make a builder out of it, and that can really help reduce the size of your containers by not storing 90% of what's necessary there. Like I still feel like that's really esoteric, and most people are not aware that the Open Container Initiative supports that sort of reduction.
Are you talking about like using like a multi-stage Docker build where you run your build process and then store that as an artifact and then launch a new Docker image?
There's actually in the Docker, that's one thing, right? For sure in multi-stage, 100%. No, there's actually in the Docker file, you can specify multiple images. And one of the images you can say this is my builder, and then have the tools in there. And then another image lower down that says, this is the actual source image I want. Because there's just so many runtime versus execution time problems that come up where in the previous world, we were in a state where they're the same thing and it's really expensive, but now we're much better off. Like you can get Rust containers down from gigabytes to really megabytes because the builder is big and expensive, but the actual built image is just pretty much a wrap binary.
Yeah.
That's the crazy thing, especially in the area of like build optimization. There's so much low-hanging fruit everywhere, but it's all different low-hanging fruit. And you have to do some degree of looking into it to figure out that you can grab this thing and put it in here, and all of a sudden from gigabytes to megabytes. But it's so common to hear that, I brought my build time down from 90 seconds to 9 seconds, or I brought it down from 5 minutes to 1 minute. And these are massive improvements, and you build all the time. And they're right there, they're sitting there, but it's not often connected.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think for a lot of people, there's just they've done the build process, and it took a long time, and they just were like, oh, I guess that's the way it is, not realizing that there are a lot of knobs you can tweak to change that.
Yeah. And I think, depending on where you are in the build process, if you're on your laptop and you're building, you want it to be like super fast. And if it's 2 minutes, it's going to be a bit annoying. But if you're merging your PR and you're waiting for it to go to a staging environment, like if it's 5 minutes, you're probably okay with it. You're probably like, okay, this is fine. And trying to get it from 5 to 2 minutes is probably like not that big of a deal for you because you don't do it that often. So then like, when would you ever want to optimize that? But across all the devs and all the merges, it adds up. It's a lot of time. Like you could have gone faster.
For sure. Well, sweet. Is there anything else we should talk about? I feel like we kind of just ran the gauntlet here.
Yeah, we did.
So if folks are interested in learning more about kurtosis, Um, what where do y'all hang out at online?
Discord. Well, first of all, I recommend going to our GitHub. The GitHub is the place where you enter. So like GitHub, it's got our code, it's got our docs there, it's got the README. So if you want to learn about business, go right to the GitHub. And then if you want to chat with us, we're always chatting with the community. So join our Discord and we'll be there. You can DM us, you can chat with us in the general channel. It's fun.
Right on. Cool. Yeah, and I've been chatting with y'all a little bit. You really are super active and super responsive online, which is nice, and it's refreshing to see.
Yeah, it's the fun part. The fun part is chatting with the users.
See, that's just so anti-tech right there. Like, like I would love tech if it weren't for the damn users.
I feel like there's a difference of, the outward appearance versus what you're thinking when they're actually saying things.
And it's also the users that you're talking with too. When you're talking with people who are doing the same thing, whether they're software engineers or whatever, I think that's a different experience than trying to talk mod through getting her dial-up modem connected and clearing out her Internet Explorer cache or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a difference between support, right, for something and real engagement with your customers. Yeah, for sure. I usually come away from them like, oh no, we should have that feature. I can't believe we didn't think of it.
I mean, one of the fun things about having a developer tool is it's by engineers for engineers. There's a lot of empathetic connection across the product user barrier, where maybe if we weren't the exact same profile, you'd have to bridge the gap somehow.
Well, I've heard many times that that's what makes a successful startup is whenever you're solving a problem that you personally have.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Galen, thanks for being on the show, man. This has been a really cool talk.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Cool. Warren, thanks for joining me. Welcome back. Glad to have you back on the show.
Glad to be here.
And for all of the listeners, thank you for listening. Really appreciate it. Hope you found it useful. Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah. Picks. All right. You brought it up. Kick us off, Warren.
I just, I know some listeners were going to be mad if they didn't hear on the recording what the picks were.
Right.
Yeah. So mine this week is Turn the Ship Around by David Marquet, which is a book that, irrelevant of your experience in technology or what you're focused on, either core engineering or somewhere else, can really help take your understanding of how to work effectively to the next level. It's really about leadership in every way, starting from the bottom all the way up, and how to think about it. And I think it's a really interesting read. And if you feel like you can't commit to doing that, you can find 10 minutes to watch the shortened video online. Something of Greatness. I can never remember the name of the title. It's a YouTube video. You can find it, which is it's hilarious, and it's really good content.
Right on. Awesome. Galen, putting you on the spot. What'd you bring for a pick?
My pick. It can be music.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So I have been very into Jelly Roll lately. I don't know if you guys know Jelly Roll. Country singer.
Oh, yeah. He's the country Post Malone.
Yes. That's hilarious. I'd never heard it before, but as soon as you said it, I knew that you were thinking of the right person. Yes, country Post Malone. Jelly Roll's amazing. I've just been. It's rare that I find an artist and then I just listen to a dozen of his songs on a regular basis. He hit me with all of them. So if you haven't checked out Jelly Roll, if you're into country, if you're into hip hop, it's a really nice combination of both. So check out Jelly Roll. For sure.
Yeah. I last year I stumbled across Hardy, and which Hardy is like country meets heavy metal.
Ooh.
Or hard rock, and then at some point he did a collaboration with Jelly Roll, which took me down that path. Yeah, so I'll agree with you on that one. That's pretty cool, and it's it's definitely not what you would expect from country music. It's quite a bit different. Not sure Hank Williams Sr. would approve of it, but here we are. Cool. So I brought 2 picks this week. The first one is going to totally destroy my nerd credibility because I have never read the book Dune or seen the movie Dune. So I am starting to read the book Dune. And
Dune may
right?
be one of the best books I've ever read. I mean, the things that Herbert does in the book is just unmatched by other stories. Realistically, like you can tell us by the number of new concepts and things that were just made up. It's not like a world that just easily imaginable.
Right on. I'm looking forward to it. And I've heard from multiple people, it's a common saying, oh, the book's better than the movie. But I've heard from multiple people like, no, the book is better than the movie on many, many levels. So I'm looking forward to getting into that. The other pick I'm going to bring up is I kind of fell out of love with Chrome as my browser, and I wanted to see what else was out there. Chrome, it's not you, it's me. I just felt like I need to see other browsers. But across the Arc browser, and I think I completely locked up.
We hear you.
I did.
You're maybe back.
I got completely kicked out for talking trash about Chrome, didn't I? I'm going to go through with it anyway. The Arc browser has been really cool. I've been using it for about a week now, and there's so many cool, subtle little features that I didn't realize belonged in a browser. Like my favorite one is when you're in a Google Meet, and you navigate off to another tab, and then somebody asks you a question, you can never find which tab is the one for Meet, right? So then you got this awkward silence and you got to admit that you were screwing off and not paying attention to the meeting. But with the Arc browser, when you leave the tab, it just puts a little thumbnail in the corner of your screen with that video meet still going. So when you have to go back to it, it's just down there in the corner. You click into it and it pops you right back up. And I just thought that was super cool. So that's my second pick for the week.
Nice.
And with that, I think we're done here. Galen, thanks again. Man, this has been pretty cool. I've enjoyed it. I hope the listeners enjoyed it. Thank you for listening. We appreciate your support. And yeah, I'll see y'all next week.